Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the official History of Palladium Books. This time, I'll be asking the questions because I figure you're all wondering who the heck is this man who's been asking me all these questions? Where does he come from? Why him? So let's find out. J.M. DeFoggy, videographer, game designer, writer, all around nice guy.
Oh.
What was your first role-playing game?
Oh, man. So the first one that I played or the first one that I owned?
Because first one that you played, I think. And then the first one you owned.
Well, the first one I played was GURPS. GURPS 3rd edition. Revised, the softbound that had like the bubbles on the cover, and each bubble had like a character from a different realm. I showed up for my first day of middle school, just angry as all get out because it was supposed to be junior high, and I was finally not going to have to go to school with my little brother. And that was the year that they went from 7th and 8th grade to 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And sure enough, my little brother, 1 year younger than me, ended up in the same school with me. And I was angry. And this kid at my lunch table, Carl Johnson, who another friend of mine knew. I was really good friends with this guy named Adam. And he was friends with this kid named Carl. And Carl's like, "Hey, you want to play a game?" I'm like, "Sure. What are we going to play?" He's like, "It's called GURPS." I'm like, "What the hell's a GURPS?" And so we sat down, and it was like Thursday. We made characters for a police game. He wanted to run a game. We were all law enforcement, and then he ran our first session Friday, and I kind of walked away with three very clear mental images. One, this game that I had at home was a game. Like having played a role-playing game, I finally understood what I was reading. Because here's the thing, back in the early days, and I don't feel like I was that early, this was the mid 80s, late 80s, there still was, you had to learn it from someone else. Like that was how we learned our hobby. Like someone taught us, or we watched someone play Dungeons and Dragons or GURPS or whatever. And then it all made sense. But if someone was trying to explain it to you, or even sometimes the rules, because it was such a different mode of game than anything I had played before. And we didn't have the advantage of YouTube where I could go and watch Critical Role or any of these other how to play channels. So I knew the game I had at home was a role-playing game. I knew that I loved what we just did, and quite arrogantly I was like, I can do a better job than Carl. And I took over the campaign on Monday, and we played GURPS Supers for the rest of the year. Well, actually, we played GURPS Supers, and then we transitioned into the game that I had at home. Because
Which was
Heroes Unlimited revised.
Good man.
A buddy of mine traded it to me for my lunch in 5th grade. And what I knew about it is that I could make these characters for stories that I was writing. And I thought it was just this great engine for making superheroes. And I had reams of paper with superheroes. And then GURPS put it all together for me. And I'm like, Heroes Unlimited is a role-playing game where I can play as superheroes. And I have been joyfully the forever GM since about 7th grade.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm the forever GM as well. And I think if you have a knack for it,
yeah.
Role-playing games are just very natural and delightfully fun.
Yeah.
That makes total sense. So Heroes Unlimited was your first Palladium.
It was.
What did you go on to other things or other games or?
Well, what was interesting was, for the longest time, and this is something I've always loved about Palladium games, is like really you assume that like the core rule book is all you need. I don't think I owned a copy of Villains Unlimited or Aliens Unlimited till I was in college. I just had Heroes Unlimited, and that's all that I needed to run. That book fell apart decades ago. But then a couple of years later, and I think I've chatted with you about this. I loved Marvel 2099.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, Spider-Man 2099 and the X-Men 2099 were just spectacular. And I mean, I couldn't go a month without seeing Rifts. And so I got Rifts for my birthday in 94, I think.
So you're saying our ads in those comic books really paid off?
Well, I mean, at least that brought me here. So yes, I would say that they did. And I'll be honest, I got Rifts, and I'm not saying I didn't run a Heroes Unlimited campaigns after that, but I basically ran Rifts for the next decade. Kind of, that was my main go-to game. Like, we had a gaming group in high school, we had 3 GMs, and I always GM'd Rifts, and my buddy always GM'd Shadowrun or Earth Dawn. He was a big, we all played BattleTech together, and so he really bought into all of the other FASA games. There was another guy, and I don't remember what he ran. I think he liked White Wolf games, but when I got to college,
my son was attracted to those.
Yeah.
Yeah, he loved being, part of Palladium, but World of Darkness was his
love.
Yeah.
I see. I like reading about the Shadow. I don't necessarily like playing the Shadow, if that makes sense. Like, from a Jungian kind of space, I want to play the hero. Like, even if I die, at least I played the hero. And then I lucked out because I went to college, and the first person I met who gamed at college was a Rifts player, and they lived about an hour and a half away from college. And so every weekend after classes ended, we drove to his house, and his gaming group was like 20 people. And so we had this golden era of gaming where we would show up for 3 days. We would, just sleep, when we needed to. And basically we had 20 players, and most of them were GMs. And some of these people are still friends to this day. And we would show up and be like, all right, I got an adventure for like 6 level characters, but you really need to bring this guy because it ties into the last adventure that I ran with that guy. And we would split up. And then as the adventures ended, the players would come back together. We'd order pizza and be like, all right, who's got another idea? What level? All right, do we need to make new characters? All right, and we would, for 4 years, that was how we played games. And, it was I think they call it West Marches style, because it was a little like that. Players would show up when the GMs were available, but we didn't have a label. We just knew we had a lot of people who all loved this. I mean, somebody would run Nightbane, or, we'd have 2 or 3 Rifts adventures going on, or Heroes Unlimited game. It was always Palladium. And my buddy Tim's house, his parents' house had big living room, a huge basement, and then a wonderful attic space. And so we could just very easily, all right, go into 3 levels. We could have 3 games going, and yeah, it was awesome.
That's great. Sort of your mini Detroit Gaming Center. Very
mini, because I think we just had all of us together were the size of your game, the Detroit Gaming Center. But yeah, it was. And I think, again, the stories that you hear, like that you would share in the Rifter or in, letters and such, where, the Defilers campaign, we didn't know that, Dungeons and Dragons thought that, a 4 to 8 person table was the perfect size. Like, I learned to run on 12 player games because, that's the way you described, running, 12 to 18 player games. It's like, okay, I guess this is just the normal group size for something like this. And I haven't had that experience again until I run a club for my son at his school, I run a role-playing game club, and they don't want to break up into smaller groups. They want a 15-man game. And so I'm like, okay, we're going to play a 15-man game. Let's get through this.
It can be done. Obviously, you're doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not to say you should necessarily do it. I just want to interject. While I like big games and JM is getting used to larger game groups, it's whatever you feel comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
And the typical game, I mean, be honest, JM, I was like you. I just had so many people joining my game. I never really thought about it until years later when I realized, the typical game is 4 to 6 players.
Yeah.
And most GMs consider a large game, 8 or more.
Yeah.
To me, that's typical. And because I gamed with so many people to begin with, I really I prefer games that are 8 to 12 people. That's my perfect number. I can play with larger groups and I can play with smaller groups.
Yeah.
And there is a different dynamic when you play with a smaller group. I mean, there's a little bit more intimacy. Each character gets to do a little bit more, or is kind of required to do a little bit more.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool. Yeah. And I think it's cool that you're running a game group at the school. That's
yeah.
great.
I this last year was Savage Worlds, and this year I'm going to try and get Heroes Unlimited in there for the kids. I'll let you know.
Yeah, nice.
If they vote.
Now you're a Call of Cthulhu guy, aren't you? So how did you discover Chaosium?
So early on, so there was this great game store within walking distance of my high school. And it's not there anymore. I think they moved towns. I think it's still around. Friends Hobby. And I could, if I had a free period, if I left right when, fourth period got done, I could make it to Friends Hobby in about 8 minutes. And that would give me a solid half hour off campus. And then I could be back in time for my next class. And I came to Chaosium. I didn't play Call of Cthulhu for until the guy who loved Shadowrun moved from Shadowrun to Call of Cthulhu. I fell in love with Glorantha and RuneQuest. I got the Cults of Terror book and was hooked. I couldn't. Bob, who ran the game store, could never get a core book in for me. So I would always I had these I never got to play RuneQuest. I always had these little picture, glimpses through, I was pressing my face up to a keyhole and seeing little glimpses of the world. But what was cool about it is it gave me a ton of fodder for my Palladium fantasy games, my Rifts games, and especially because Chaosium uses, BRP uses a D100 skill system.
Right.
I had these crazy little charts for converting RuneQuest things into the Palladium fantasy game so that I could use them. But I never really got to play until actually just in the last, 5 or 6 years. But the wonderful thing was I do a podcast called the Iconic Podcast, and it was for a game called 13th Age. And they put out a 13th Age Glorantha book, and I went to interview a bunch of people, and that just sort of opened the door to Chaosium, and they've been wonderful. And I've got a buddy, we do a little show called Exploring Glorantha together, so that, it's a massive world. And so we're trying to do your 100 level introduction course to the world of Glorantha. But I did that. I got into Dungeons and Dragons in college because somebody at my church was like, "You're playing BattleTech and Star Wars. You should play the Christian role-playing game Dragon Raid." And we got to the end of that first Dragon Raid session, and he's like, "What did you think?" And I'm like, "Dungeons and Dragons has to be better than this." And I went out and bought my first copy of the Player's Handbook and went, "Oh yeah, it is better than this." I mean, I've run some Dungeons and Dragons campaigns. I've got like a bookshelf over here with all of my first and second edition and clones and such, but it's never been a lot of people. It's their introduction to the game. I mean, superheroes were my introduction to the game. So when I love old school games. So I love games like I'm going to run Hyperborea tonight. But it's kind of like when I think of the nostalgia of my early gaming days, I go back to Rifts and Heroes Unlimited because that's what it was.
Nice.
Yeah.
So you've played a lot of games then. Do you consider yourself like a super gamer? I mean, have you played 20, 30, 40? Like I know guys like Carmen Belair who has probably tried at least everything under the sun. I mean, and that includes hundreds of board games and as well as role-playing games. Is that you, or are you a little bit more discriminating?
So when it comes to board games, there was a time I used to manage a game store. I mean, I've got a really eclectic past. I used to manage a game store in Colorado Springs, and I had a 45% discount. And my wife wasn't playing role-playing games with me at that point, but she loved board games. And so like every 2 or 3 weeks, I'd come home with a new board game, and I would probably say I have 30 games on the shelf right now. Like we really, pared down to we're a little bit more discriminating when it comes to board gaming now, but I'll read any role-playing game. If I like it enough to do a review of it on my channel, it usually means I'm willing to give it like a one shot. So I've got a pretty large gaming group, but we tell I don't like to run. We have a minimum threshold, I think is how I put it. Like if we're in the middle of a campaign and about 50% of the people can't meet, we'll skip a week, but anybody who can come, I'll run a one shot of something. And so I'll always try and get one shots at the table. But I think you and I have had this discussion. One of the things that has killed I've run a lot of games like Shadows of Estrin. If it's a D100 based game, I'll give it a shot. I really like Modiphius's 2D20 system. So Conan and Octoon Cthulhu and Infinity. Savage Worlds I got into. I'm more discriminating about old school games now because there's just such a plethora of old school games that I'm like, but you're splitting hairs but on your differences. So I've got the 3 that I like, and I'm willing to kind of let that go. But what killed my ability to run multiple games was getting into game design, because you and I've kind of talked about this. Yeah. My Tuesday group, I'm running Hyperborea for them and we love them, but they all know that at some point I'm going to have some project. I'm going to be like, okay, we got to put the campaign on hold because I need to play test this. And they love it, but it is, I really want to get the One Ring to the table, but I'd love to try the new version of Pendragon sitting right over my shoulder, but it's probably not going to happen. So my big goal for 2025 is to finish up the 2 campaigns that I'm running. And then I've got both groups agreed to sign off. We're just going to play Palladium. So my Tuesday group, unless we're doing a play test, we're going to be playing Heroes Unlimited. And my Wednesday group are deciding between Palladium Fantasy and Rifts. So I've got one game system that I don't need to worry about prepping X and Y for different days of the week. I've got one game system to run for. And then as my development time, I can read whatever I need to kind of get in the right headspace for what I need to work on.
Well, that makes total sense. I think for most people, you can really only truly, really invest in, like you were saying, 2, 3, 4 game systems, and then others you just kind of dabble with or play with or steal things from.
Oh, yeah.
Which is fine.
My wife says you got to case it. She makes paper cards. She makes her own greeting cards that she sends to people, and she introduced me to the acronym CASE: copy and steal everything. So if you see something, find a way to make it work. I'm like, all right, like I like that. I feel like I can look at different games and go, I see what your major influences were because this works this very specific way, and so does this.
No, I like that a lot. I always joke around and say that I always try to steal from the best. Because, when you see a great idea, and there's ways right away your mind starts to go, especially as a game designer or writer, your brain just starts to go, and you're thinking, oh, I could do that differently or better, or I could incorporate that element and really run with it. And there's nothing wrong with that, And I do that with not just with games, but movies and comic books and real life. I'll see something on TV in the news or a documentary, and I'll be like, oh, that's a great idea, and I'm going to do this or that. Yeah, take ideas where they come.
Well, and they say like true genius isn't in invention, but it's in taking a bunch of things and synthesizing them into an easily accessible new format, right? Like that's what Apple was really successful at. Apple didn't invent the graphic user interface or the mouse or any of this, but they were able to see all of the components and pull them together in a really usable format. And I think we all do that as game designers. And sometimes we succeed, or even game masters, right? I just talked about a lot of people look down on tropes these days, but I did a little presentation on tropes are myth, right? They're mythic shorthand. It's what we have, and it's not something to be looked down upon. It's like myths are designed to work together in a way that eases the telling of a story, and good GMs take the tropes and they rework them, and good writers do the same thing, and they present them in brand new ways.
Well, again, there's nothing wrong with that, and there's a reason why it's become a trope or stereotypical, or it's because people know it and love it and want it, and the trick a lot of times is just putting it into a new format or tweak it in such a way where it feels new or exciting or both. So yeah, absolutely.
I was just watching.
Should do it. Writers should do it.
Yeah.
Game designers should do it.
I'm rewatching The Expanse, and I'm looking at that first season and going, well, this is that stereotype, and this is that trope, and this is that trope, right? The police chief who's this close to retirement and's checked out, and you got the hard-bitten detective who's got a heart of gold, but he doesn't want to admit it. And like, yeah, I'm instantly invested because I know my mind has these touchstones that they can go, okay, I know. All right, awesome. I'm ready for it. But they've repackaged it into a completely new setting, and it just makes it come alive for me.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, come on, think about it. All characters in video games, role-playing games, the archetype is based on all things we know. I mean, why? So everything's full of tropes because they feel familiar. Because we got to have something that grounds us to give us a starting place. So let's go with D&D. You got the wizard, the thief, the priest, the ranger. We all know what the knight, the assassin. We all know what those are.
Yeah.
And so right away, that's our window into the game, something we can relate to. And then
there are archetypes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I like to joke, right? 5,000 years ago, Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. That was 5,000 years ago. I don't think that it's the same stories. Jung talked about, this collective subconscious, and Campbell talks about the hero's journey and these like touchstones that just keep repeating. And it's like, yeah, but we love them. And they've got to mean something to us as humans because we keep coming back to them.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And it's fun. And as a writer or game designer, or as a game master, it's fun to take the tropes and the things that people expect and give them that little zing, give them that twist that makes it different, or throw in something that's unexpected. Yeah. That's great. I love it when my game group, they walk into something they think they know, and then I give them a little zinger, and they're like,
Yeah.
Oh no, we didn't see that coming. I'm like, yes.
Yeah.
Everyone's like that to some degree, I think. But so you touched upon school a little bit. So what's your background? Because I know you like how did you get into videography? And it's obvious how you kind of got into game design because you're a player and you loved it and you started to really study it and learn it. And so of course it's kind of natural to try your hand at designing things. But
Yeah.
what's some of your background and how did you get into doing these kind of videos and YouTube stuff?
Well, my background schooling wise, when I finally finished college, I got a bachelor's of science in business administration. And when my son was born, my wife and I were like, hey, this is probably the time for you to go get your master's because who needs sleep? And so I went and got my master's in, I have a master's in theology with a focus on biblical languages and ancient Near East cultures. And I love languages. I love studying languages. I love the Bronze Age. I think, you and I have talked about, between Palladium fantasy game with the Ennead as the pantheon of light and dark and Glorantha, I had really no chance of ever escaping the Bronze Age mythological cycle because it's what I love. And so I got into game design through a friend. Again, I'm doing this iconic podcast, and I interviewed Tim Brown, who did Dark Sun. He worked at TSR, did Dark Sun, did a couple of board games and did some stuff at GDW. And I needed a special guest because one of the game stores I was helping manage was doing a convention in Denver. And I was like, well, hey, Tim, I just interviewed you. You want to come out? So we're talking about his new game, Dragon Kings. And he was like, well, hey, do you want to write something? And that ended up through as these things usually do, through a series of dominoes falling that I could not have ever predicted. I ended up working at Ulysses Spiel, which is a German gaming company. And they do the Dark Eye, they do Torg Eternity, they do Fading Suns. Tim was like, hey, this Critical Role thing's starting to get popular. Do you think you would be able to run a Dark Eye game for us? We'd pay you to do it. And I ran probably a 20-session Dark Eye game, and it was the first time I'd ever tried to stream anything on the internet, and it was awful. We had a lot of fun. I feel like the people who watched it enjoyed it, but the people at Ulysses really liked it. And so they ended up building me a studio in Colorado Springs. I got to design it, and we ended up running Fading Suns and Torg. So twice a week, Thursdays and Fridays, I was streaming their games. And I learned everything that could and did go wrong in videography and So between my work, my day job as a medical device consultant, I was doing video editing for them. And then I was doing podcast editing for the Iconic podcast. And then I was doing the streaming stuff. Is kind of how all of this sort of came together. And when I moved to Texas, they moved the studio for me, which is where I'm recording right now. And I streamed multiple games out of the studio. I do a show twice a week. I did a Savage Worlds game. I did a Torg Eternity campaign. I had started a third Savage Worlds game, and then I got real sick and had to stop all of that. Like the stress of streaming a live show is very high. So then, but Pinnacle liked what I was doing with what I did with Savage Worlds. And so they brought me on to I do a community show for them once a week where we just talk with people who are producing stuff in the Savage Worlds environment. And from that and doing some video editing for Chaosium, that's how we got here, because a friend of mine who worked at Pinnacle was working with you and was like, hey, we need somebody to do what you're doing in these other areas of your life for Palladium.
Yep, I think we can give Chris Landauer a shout out.
We should give him a shout out because
I appreciate the introduction because this has gone great, and we become friends as well as co-workers, and
my son.
Thank you, Chris.
Chris, seriously, thank you. Because my son at Christmas was like, how cool is it that you just got off the phone with the guy who wrote your favorite role-playing game? I'm like, it is so cool.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, it is wild because, when you're in this kind of a business, you meet all these people who, in their own little pond are big deals.
Mm-hmm.
As Wayne Smith likes to describe me sometimes as Kevin's a big fish in a small pond. I'll take it.
Yeah.
And it's funny because all these other fish. Like one of the things I drove for Sean Robertson, my creative director and business partner, his first Gen Con with us. I just think of all these people as friends and just other professional buddies. And for Sean, especially in those early days, it was like, Jeff, that was just Mike Pondsmith. And I'm like, oh yeah. He's like, why didn't you introduce me? And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm really bad at that. And the poor guy was on the other side of the booth and teleported to my side so I could introduce him to Mike Pondsmith. And do I? No. And then I do the same thing to him with Mike Stackpole and a bunch of other folks. And I'm like, I'm sorry, Sean. To me, they're just buddies.
Yeah, you've been in the industry for so long. I will be honest, the first Gen Con that I went to, and I don't expect you to remember this, but the first Gen Con that I went to was when 4th edition was announced. I made sure to go by the booth and just thank you for all of the gaming that we've done. But you get 1,000 of those every Gen Con. But there's a little bit, there is meeting that first Gen Con that I worked for Ulysses. They're like, hey, can you and your wife come out and man our booth? We've got a booth this Gen Con. And we're like, sure, we'll do that. We had the Gaunt Man from Torg, a little standout. We had nothing else for Torg, just saying it was coming. But Torg was one of those games that was like a game designer's game. I don't know that it was ever as popular. I joke that at my high school, you either, listened to the Smashing Pumpkins or were a Pearl Jam fan and were shoved into lockers. And you either played riffs or you played Torg, but you never the riffs group and the Torg group kind of glared at each other across the library, but we didn't interact. But, John Wick comes up and is like, oh man, I love Torg. Tell me about it. And I'm like, and my wife's like, if you want to get into this industry, you really gotta bring that fanboy a little bit closer to home because you're making people uncomfortable.
Yeah, rein it in. Yeah. And actually, JM, I doubt you really made people uncomfortable. I always find it, very sweet and nice. And I get it because, I grew up in comic book fandom. So, I would walk up to these guys who are just hardworking artists and writers, and I'd be like, oh, you're a god. I didn't say that, but I'm thinking it.
Yeah.
I'd mentioned before I was so shy in my youth that, I was afraid to go up to these guys and say anything. I'd give Alex a stack of books and say, here, go have, Neil Adams or Jim Steranko or whoever, sign my books for me and then go talk to him and I'll just stand next to you and listen. Which he did, and it was great. And, then it was wild for me later to be working with guys like, Jim Steranko and Richard Corbin and Stephen Bissett and a bunch of other guys where it's like, holy crap, we're kind of peers.
Yeah.
And, it's really great. And you get over the fan thing and people who, have a fan base, they get kind of used to it and appreciate. I know I do.
Yeah.
So I hope no one ever feels embarrassed when they come up to me and gush and stutter or whatever, because it's just part of being a fan, and it's awesome. And I appreciate people coming up and saying, even if it's just thank you for, like you did the first time.
Yeah.
Thank you for the years of fun and enjoyment you've brought me. And it's like, oh, you're welcome. And that's genuine, just like their feelings are genuine. So
Yeah.
I'm sure you were fine. Although she was right, as a professional or someone who wanted to become a professional in an industry. Yeah, you can't just be a blithering fanboy.
Yeah. But what's interesting to me is I've discovered that, I mean, what you just said, for 90% of the people I've talked to in the hobby, that's been the case. Like, I know of people who own gaming companies who are like, man, I just wish people would come up and like actually submit things to me, as opposed to being like, well, I could never. And he's like, we're all just creatives as big as role-playing games have become, it's still a niche market compared to comic books or video games or any of the, really big fandoms, Doctor Who, Star Trek, Star Wars, right? People appreciate being appreciated is the best way I think I can put that.
Well, and I think that's even true of the big fandoms. I've because of Riffs being optioned by the Walt Disney Company for like 18 years before they cut it loose. I've met and been on the fringe of the big industries, video games and film. And yes, my heart went pitter patter when I got to meet David Franzoni, the writer behind Gladiator.
Yeah.
And got to meet Jerry Bruckheimer and had that fanboy moment where I'm just a blithering monkey. Just even as I'm spewing out the words, I'm thinking, shut the frick up, man. You're being a fanboy geek. Just rein it in like you were. You're reining it in. Shut up.
That's
rein
right.
It in. And I think all of them, I mean, yes, there's jerks who sit back and go, oh, yes, I am the great and powerful so-and-so. You should bow down before me. And those guys are jerkweeds.
Yeah.
But they're very much the minority. It has been my experience. And yeah, everyone appreciates their fan base if they have any sense of empathy and humility. Of course, they appreciate their fan base. They wouldn't be where they are without their fan base.
Right.
So what was your first writing gig?
Oh, man. So my first writing gig was, and it's still not been published, but hopefully next year we'll change that. I wrote the campaign for Tim's Dragon Kings. I wrote this Mephisto campaign, and my wife edited it. And it always frustrated me because I wanted to get into the business. I thought that would be cool. But as you have said on this show before, creatives, great ideas are a dime a dozen. But a really skilled editor is rare as gold. And so at every step of the way, and it was wonderful. Like, it was a huge blessing. My wife wanted to get out of being at Starbucks. And so when Ulysses came knocking at our door for a full-time position, it was not for JM, the game designer, or JM, the videographer. It was for Trisha, the editor. And which is great. Like, she has a real knack for it. But I remember that because she edited the campaign, and there were several gruesome points in the campaign where her comment was, "This is fantastic, but what is wrong with you?" So, I feel like it meant my view of hell was very on point. My first published gig was actually for a small company called Reroll Productions. They made Fate supplements. And I'm not a huge Fate player, but they came to me and said, "Hey, we got this really great pitch. We need someone to write." And my one of my friends had been doing some work for them and is like, "This is actually like right up James' alley." And their pitch was, they're like, "We want Jason Bourne, but in a fantasy world where everyone has magic." And I'm like, "Okay, what else do you have?" And they're like, "That's it. What can you do with this?" And I wrote the setting for a game called Shadowcraft. And basically I took that pitch and I made it into a Cold War style game set in Arcadia between the Seelie and the Unseelie court. And you were playing the descendants of human babies that the Fae had stolen. And so, having lived in Arcadia for so long, you had these magical abilities, but the Seelie and the Unseelie courts were still at war. And it seemed to do well. It still seems to do well. I get some residuals from that, from day to day, and that kind of gave me the confidence doing work for Tim and having him go, yeah, I really like this, and doing the work for Reroll. And so I started helping out because through the Iconic podcast, became friends with the designers of 13th Age and ended up helping. I'm actually the line developer over at 13th Age. So as new books come out, I'm the one who does development passes. I interview new ideas and we put books together. I'm kind of the evil overlord, as I like to call it, and just make sure it gets through the process. But the real big, my real big, writing, designing thing was, again, like I said, I get this call from Tim going, hey, I'm now working for Ulysses. Do you and Trish want to come to Gen Con this year and man our booth? So we made it work. And the booth right next to ours was Osprey Games. And I stood next to this guy, Phil, all weekend. And we were talking about history and we're talking about gaming, and we were sneaking books from one table to the other, doing little trades. I walked home with a bunch of Osprey books. He walked home with a bunch of Ulysses books. And we corresponded over the next year. In fact, I still correspond with him almost on a daily basis. And yep, that's where Jackals came from. I was telling him about this campaign I was running and how I didn't like the system I was using. And he was like, well, what system would you use? If you could design your own system, what would it be? And I thought about it for the weekend and put together a little 3-page brief of what I would really want from a Jackal system. And he's like, cool, we'd like to have you write this game. And I put out three Jackals books. And this year I'm going to say it, I'm committing to do one Jackals PDF a month. And I got the first one done. And hopefully I'll be able to collect them at the end of the year and have a fourth Jackals book, but I'm going to be releasing those on drive-through. And Jackals is this Bronze Age historical adjacent world with magic and monsters, and heavily inspired by the Palladium system. I think we talked about, Kevin, you and I, like reactive combat. So it's not like I'm sitting around waiting for my turn. I always have I have a limited resource in like reacting to things, and D100 skill-based system. And yeah, that's
you
the game.
Stole from the best.
I stole from the best.
RuneQuest, Palladium.
I know, right? Now Jackals. I also, and then I'm hopefully, so then they asked me to do this one. Where is it? So Urban Decay uses the same system as Jackals, but is based off the 1970s, 1980s sort of like the Warriors, right? Or Streets of Rage, the video game, where you're playing a crew who is trying to stop these corporate overlords from taking over your neighborhood. And it's as they put it, it's a beat 'em up role-playing game. And I have plans to do like a Marvel Knights style expansion where you could play like Moon Knight or the Punisher or Cloak and Dagger, like add a layer of superpowers to it. But we'll see if that one ever comes into being. But that's really what it was. I mean, for a decade, I did fan podcasts. I interacted with people at conventions and talked to them, and slowly but surely, people were like, "Hey, that idea is worth, at least a contract. Let's see if you can get it done." And I'm not as fast as I used to be, health reasons, but one of the things if any of you are looking at trying to get into the industry, meeting a deadline is probably worth more than your creative idea. Because the reason people keep offering me work is because I keep hitting deadlines. And like if I say I can get it done in a certain amount of time.
Yeah, at some point we're going to have to. Obviously, we're doing the history of Palladium right now,
which I love. Thank you for letting me do this. This is so much fun.
Oh, I'm having a blast as well. But down the road, once we've covered the history of Palladium, we'll have to do a lot more episodes about game design and
I would love to do that.
Yeah, me too. Because I think people need it, and not just as a game designer point of view. I think game masters too, because there's a lot of the same tools and thought processes that go into creating a game for yourself and your half a dozen players, or even 2 players.
Yeah.
As goes into designing a book or creating adventures.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely, we'll definitely do that.
Looking forward to it.
Well, JM, I thought this was great. Is there anything you feel like you need to add or want to say?
I mean, not really. I was gonna, like and subscribe at Palladium Books. We're going to keep doing these. I love being able to sit down and talk the history of Palladium Books with you, Kevin. I'm looking forward to doing a lot more of the, starting that second playlist where we're doing GM and game design stuff. If you want to find me, you can find me on YouTube at Iconic Production. You'll see this face with or without beard. And I tend to do a lot of things on the philosophy of gaming and philosophy of beauty as it relates to gaming. But yeah, I mean, stay tuned. We've got so much content planned. It's going to be awesome.
Absolutely. Sounds good. Tune in next time, guys and gals.